It was just after sunrise when the world's most recognizable palace found itself at the center of a moment that would etch itself into history. The London air was crisp, the kind that makes every sound sharper, every emotion more vivid. Outside Buckingham Palace, the early morning quiet was broken not by the rustle of tourists, but by the hum of tension that no one could quite put into words. Reporters who had been camped out for days suddenly shifted from idle chatter to an urgent scramble as a royal aide stepped out from the ornate front gates carrying a leather-bound folder. No one needed to be told what was inside. Its very appearance sent a silent shockwave through the assembled crowd. The palace press team never moved with this kind of speed unless something monumental was about to happen. Across the world, televisions and smartphone notifications lit up in unison with the same 5 words plastered across breaking news banners. The king has stepped aside. In an age where rumors often outpace facts, people paused, because this was no rumor. This was a seismic shift in the heart of Britain's monarchy, a decision that could only have come from one man, and one man alone, King Charles III. But what followed in the official statement stunned even the most seasoned royal watchers. It did not speak of temporary arrangements, or of regency, or of ceremonial duties being shared. It stated, in direct and unmistakable language, that effective immediately, His Royal Highness William, Prince of Wales, would ascend to the throne as the new King of the United Kingdom and the Commonwealth. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. For a moment, the world seemed to stop breathing. In households from London to Lagos, from Sydney to Seattle, conversations halted mid-sentence. Those watching live news coverage could see the same expression reflected in the faces of the broadcasters themselves. Confusion mixed with awe, a flicker of disbelief struggling to process a reality that, until now, had seemed years, perhaps decades, away. Kings don't just step aside overnight. Crowning a new monarch is supposed to be a slow, deliberate act, steeped in the weight of centuries-old tradition. And yet here it was, unfolding like a political thriller in real time. Inside the palace, the corridors that usually echoed with the low murmur of staff and the muted footfall of guards had been buzzing since the night before. Whispered conversations slipped through half-closed doors. Clipped orders carried the unmistakable tension of urgency. The inner circle of the royal family had been summoned late in the evening to a private meeting in the king's private apartments. The content of that meeting would remain sealed to the public for now, but those present later described the atmosphere as a mixture of solemnity and inevitability, like watching a storm you knew was coming finally break over the horizon. The first photographs of William after the announcement told their own story. He was dressed immaculately in a dark navy suit, the cut sharp, the tie subtly patterned. But his eyes, deep-set and focused, betrayed a maelstrom of emotion. There was no sweeping grin, no theatrical wave. Instead, he appeared as a man shouldering the weight of an entire nation's expectations in a single breath. This was not the gradual preparation he had been groomed for since childhood. This was a handover under circumstances so sudden that even those closest to him seemed unsure how to react. The public, too, found themselves grappling with questions that had no immediate answers. Was King Charles gravely ill? Had political pressures behind closed doors forced his hand? Or was this a calculated act of preservation, a recognition that the monarchy could only survive if it passed to a younger, more relatable face? Each theory carried its own emotional charge, and in the hours after the announcement, speculation became as much a part of the story as the facts themselves. In the middle of all this uncertainty, one image began circulating on social media, an image that would ignite debates and conspiracy theories in equal measure. It showed King Charles and Prince William in the palace garden, heads bent close in conversation, their expressions unreadable. The photograph was reportedly taken 2 days before the announcement, during a private family gathering. For some, it was a touching glimpse of a father preparing his son for the crown. For others, it hinted at a deeper, more urgent conversation, one that perhaps revealed more about the king's state of mind than any official statement ever could. As news networks scrambled to compile montages of William's life, from his boyhood grief walking behind Princess Diana's coffin, to his years as a devoted husband and father, to his steady rise as a working royal, it became clear that this was not just a personal transition. It was a generational handover in a monarchy that has always walked a careful line between tradition and adaptation. For decades, the British royal family had operated under the unspoken rule that succession was not to be rushed. But now, that rule had been shattered, and the speed with which it had been done left even veteran historians and constitutional scholars blinking in disbelief. If the nation's attention was fixed on William, the emotional undercurrent was impossible to ignore. For supporters, his ascension represented hope, a younger monarch in tune with modern Britain, a family man with a stable marriage and a relatable public image. But for others, it triggered unease. Was the stability of the monarchy being compromised by haste? Was the suddenness of the announcement a sign of deeper instability at the very heart of the crown? And what, exactly, had pushed King Charles to act now? In pubs, offices, and online forums, conversations swirled with urgency. Royal loyalists spoke in hushed tones about doing what's best for the institution. Critics demanded transparency, pointing out that the public deserved more than vague reassurances and carefully crafted press statements. And somewhere between those two extremes sat millions of ordinary people who felt, in their gut, that something about this day was bigger than just the changing of a title. Yet, amid the speculation, one truth was impossible to ignore. The man now called King William IV had not asked for this moment to arrive so soon, but it had arrived nonetheless. Whether he had days, hours, or mere minutes to prepare, he now stood on the threshold of a reign that would define the monarchy for the 21st century. His first words as king, carefully delivered in a televised address that evening, were calm, measured, and resolute. But beneath the polished delivery, those who knew him best could hear the echo of something else. Determination, yes. Duty, of course. But also the unmistakable undercurrent of a man who understood that the circumstances of his crowning would forever shape how history remembered him. And so the questions lingered, unanswered but impossible to forget. Why now? Why this way? And what would the reign of King William mean for a royal family already navigating the most turbulent era of its modern history? This was not the coronation Britain had imagined. It was something far more complex, far more charged, and depending on whom you asked, either a brilliant stroke of survival or the beginning of a gamble that could change the monarchy forever. The hours following the announcement unfolded like a fever dream for the United Kingdom. Streets that had been quiet at dawn were suddenly filled with people clutching newspapers, pointing to headlines, speaking to strangers as though the need to share disbelief made everyone momentarily connected. London's iconic red buses carried passengers who craned their necks at every electronic billboard they passed, reading the same words over and over, as if repetition might make them easier to comprehend. The air felt heavier, not with grief, but with the kind of unsettled energy that comes when the familiar order of things is abruptly rewritten. International news outlets began broadcasting wall-to-wall coverage. From Times Square to Tokyo, anchors spoke with urgency. Analysts were pulled into studios, and footage from Britain rolled in on a loop. William leaving the palace in a black Range Rover, Catherine walking a pace behind him, her face composed but unreadable, royal staff darting in and out of side entrances, their expressions betraying the knowledge that something historic had just been set in motion. Theories multiplied with every passing hour. Was this a planned move, disguised until the last possible moment to avoid media frenzy? Or had something happened in the preceding days, a revelation, a health scare, a crisis, that made the handover unavoidable? Within the palace walls, the shift in atmosphere was palpable. Staff who had served through decades of royal protocol found themselves in uncharted territory. Invitations for upcoming engagements were pulled back. Calls from heads of state were being routed to a different office. In the Queen's Gallery, where portraits of past monarchs lined the walls, a team was discreetly measuring space for a new edition. A portrait that would mark the beginning of King William's reign. For all the grandeur of monarchy, transitions like this are part theater, part logistics, and part raw human emotion. And in this case, the rawness was difficult to ignore. The statement issued by King Charles, though formal in tone, contained lines that carried weight far beyond their carefully chosen words. He spoke of duty, of continuity, and of his confidence in his son. But there was also a thread of finality, a subtle acknowledgement that his own chapter as sovereign had ended sooner than expected. Those who have followed Charles's life closely knew how much he had waited for the crown, how decades of public service had shaped his vision for the monarchy. To step away after such a short reign was almost unthinkable, unless the circumstances made it unavoidable. People close to the family hinted, without confirming, that the decision had not come easily. One aide reportedly described the night before the announcement as a marathon of conversations, stretching late into the evening, with family members alternating between moments of quiet reflection and bursts of heated debate. Those who know William said his acceptance was measured, not an eagerness to claim the throne, but a willingness to do what was needed when called. It was the same steadiness that had defined his public image for years, now tested in a way no amount of preparation could truly match. As the sun climbed higher over the capital, the crowd outside Buckingham Palace grew. People brought flowers, not because of mourning, but as a gesture of marking a moment. Schoolchildren on field trips pressed their faces to the palace gates, asking teachers why there were so many cameras. Tourists stumbled into history without planning to, their vacation snapshots now containing the backdrop of a national turning point. And all the while, inside, William was already being briefed on matters of state, security, and the constitutional responsibilities that had now shifted squarely onto his shoulders. By mid-afternoon, the first public sighting of William as king occurred. He stood on the steps of Clarence House, flanked by Catherine, addressing a small crowd of reporters. The speech lasted less than 5 minutes, but every word was dissected by commentators for tone, intention, and underlying meaning. He thanked his father for his service, acknowledged the gravity of the moment, and spoke briefly of the challenges ahead. It was a performance of composure, calm, direct, free from any hint of drama. Yet, for those who have watched him grow from boyhood to this moment, there was a subtle edge to his voice, a quiet determination that signaled he understood the magnitude of what lay ahead. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, reactions from Prince Harry and Meghan Markle, or the lack thereof, were becoming a story of their own. Social media users tracked their movements. Journalists speculated on whether they had been informed in advance or blindsided like much of the public. This absence of visible response from Harry's camp was interpreted in many ways. Some saw it as dignified restraint, others as a sign of deep division. Whatever the truth, it added another layer to the already complex narrative of the day. By early evening, the city had taken on the strange stillness that follows a major event. The chaos of breaking news had begun to settle into the realization that nothing would undo what had happened that morning. Flags bearing the royal standard were adjusted, official portraits were being reprinted, and government offices prepared to update formal documents. This was the slow, almost invisible machinery of monarchy at work, ensuring that the change at the top filtered into every corner of public life. As night fell, the palace released one more image. This time an official portrait of King William. Dressed in a simple navy suit, standing beside a desk with a single family photograph placed deliberately at the edge, he looked directly into the camera. The expression was not celebratory. It was steady, serious, the gaze of a man who knew he had stepped into a role that would demand every part of him, every day, for the rest of his life. The photo was accompanied by a brief message from the new king, reaffirming his commitment to serve with loyalty, respect, and steadfast devotion. The day had begun with uncertainty, and it ended with a clarity that was as sobering as it was historic. Britain had a new king, not through the slow march of time, but through an abrupt, deliberate act that would be analyzed for years to come. The reasons behind it, the private conversations that shaped it, and the ripple effects it would have on the royal family and the nation were still unfolding. But for now, one truth stood unshaken. The reign of King William had begun, and with it, a new chapter in the story of the monarchy, one written in a moment when no one, not even those inside the palace walls, had expected the page to turn. The morning of the announcement had the kind of charged atmosphere that feels impossible to stage, no matter how rehearsed a palace might be in handling historic events. It began quietly enough, but the stillness was deceptive. A cold, early morning fog clung to the streets of London, the kind that muffles sound and blurs outlines. But inside the palace, every step echoed. Staff moved quickly, their voices low, their hands clutching folders and sealed envelopes that seemed heavier than paper had any right to be. Something had been set in motion overnight, and the final moment of revelation was approaching. The first official signal came in the form of a small change on the royal family's official website. In place of the usual gallery of scheduled events, a single placeholder message appeared. Statement from Buckingham Palace to follow. It was a subtle clue, but those who had been following the monarchy for years knew that such a change was rarely without significance. Within minutes, royal correspondents began tweeting hints, and the BBC's main news channel interrupted its morning program to inform viewers that an important palace communication would be delivered at 9 a.m. By the time the hour struck, the media presence outside Buckingham Palace had swelled. Seasoned reporters stood shoulder to shoulder with camera crews, their breath visible in the cold air, as the gates swung open and Sir Clive Alderton, the King's private secretary, stepped forward. In his hands was a formal parchment, bearing the unmistakable seal of the crown. He paused for just a moment before beginning to read. His voice was steady, deliberate, and filled the air with words that instantly rewrote the monarchy's story. It is with the deepest sense of duty and gratitude to the people of the United Kingdom and the Commonwealth that His Majesty King Charles III announces his decision to pass the crown to his son, His Royal Highness William, Prince of Wales, who shall henceforth reign as King William IV. There was no preamble, no explanation offered in that initial reading. The crowd gasped audibly. The sheer abruptness of the statement left even those who had prepared for a major announcement blinking in disbelief. Journalists scrambled to repeat the words into their microphones, their voices betraying their own astonishment. In newsrooms across the country, producers urged presenters to slow down and reread the lines, making sure there was no mistake. Within moments, television channels cut to images of the Union flag being lowered from the mast above the palace and replaced by the royal standard, the signal that the monarch was in residence. In most circumstances, this would have been a ceremonial formality. But today, with the meaning of those words still settling into the public mind, it carried a far greater weight. This was no ordinary display of royal pageantry. This was the visible handover of power. While the outside world reacted with shock, the machinery of state moved without hesitation. Government officials had been notified in the early hours, and Parliament was already preparing to convene an emergency session. Messages of acknowledgement began streaming in from heads of state around the globe. The Archbishop of Canterbury released a brief note expressing prayers and steadfast support for the new king, a phrase that only deepened speculation about the nature of the change. Meanwhile, palace aides revealed that William had been informed of the final decision only the night before. Although he had been increasingly involved in state matters over the past year, the reality of becoming king was something he had anticipated decades down the line, not in the middle of his father's reign. Sources close to him described his response as quiet, reflective, and tinged with both pride and a deep awareness of the challenges ahead. For William, there would be no gradual transition period, no long apprenticeship from behind the throne. The crown had been placed upon his head in name before the formal coronation, and with it came a kingdom's full weight of expectation. On the streets, reactions were as varied as the people themselves. Older generations, who had seen the monarchy endure wars, scandals, and political upheavals, found themselves comparing the moment to abdications of the past. Younger citizens debated whether this was a move toward modernizing the institution or a sign of underlying instability. In pubs and cafes, televisions broadcast the statement on a loop, and strangers traded opinions between sips of tea and coffee. Everyone seemed to have an interpretation, but few could say with confidence that they understood the full truth. Social media, unsurprisingly, became an instant battleground. Hashtags celebrating William's ascension trended alongside others demanding clarity on Charles's sudden step back. Conspiracy theories sprouted within hours, some claiming the king was gravely ill, others suggesting political intrigue, and still others weaving in the ever-present narratives about the tensions between the royal brothers. With no immediate explanation from the palace, the vacuum of information only fed the fire. Yet for all the noise, the physical presence of the moment was hard to ignore. The bells of Westminster Abbey rang out in long, measured peals, and across the Thames, The London Eye was lit in royal blue. Outside the palace gates, flowers began to appear, not as a tribute to loss, but as a mark of respect for the weight of change. People queued to sign books of loyalty to the new king, a tradition revived from earlier coronations. Inside the palace, preparations were already being made for William's first address to the nation. Advisors worked late into the afternoon to finalize the wording, careful to strike the balance between honoring his father's service and signaling his own vision for the monarchy's future. Every syllable mattered, every gesture would be analyzed. In that sense, the announcement was only the beginning. The real test would come in how the new king handled his first days on the throne. By evening, the streets outside the palace were still crowded, though the initial shock had settled into a strange calm. People lingered, as if waiting for one more glimpse, one more sign that the reality of the day had fully taken hold. The announcement had been made, the words recorded in history, but the meaning of those words, what they would bring for the monarchy, the nation, and the family at its center, remained a question that no parchment could answer. The night before the announcement was not one of quiet reflection in the royal apartments. It was, according to those with knowledge of the events, a tense and emotionally charged series of conversations that stretched into the early hours of the morning. The atmosphere in Buckingham Palace was unlike anything most staff had seen in decades. This was not the ceremonial preparation for a planned transition, but the frantic coordination that happens when the most powerful decision in the monarchy is accelerated by circumstances few outside those walls could begin to imagine. At the center of it all was the king himself. Charles had been unusually private in recent weeks, taking fewer public engagements and holding more one-on-one meetings with senior aides. There had been speculation about his health, though nothing official was ever confirmed. That evening, however, he summoned his most trusted advisors, members of the Privy Council, and immediate family to the White Drawing Room. A place chosen not for its grandeur, but for its seclusion. It is a room where serious matters are discussed away from the echo of ceremonial halls, its windows shuttered, its heavy drapes drawn to muffle sound. Those who attended say the gathering began with a formality that quickly gave way to something rawer. Charles addressed the room with a tone that was steady but carried an undercurrent of finality. He spoke first about his gratitude for their service and loyalty, then pivoted to what was, for many in the room, an unthinkable declaration. He intended to hand over the throne to William. The reasons, while not spelled out in precise detail, were framed in terms of what was best for the future stability of the monarchy. There were references to the public mood, to the increasing demands of modern governance, and to the necessity of a monarch who could represent the next generation without delay. Reactions varied sharply. Some were visibly stunned. Others exchanged quick glances as if to silently measure the room's temperature. A few, particularly among the older advisors, seemed almost relieved, as though they had been waiting for this decision to be spoken aloud. But the family members present were another matter entirely. William himself reportedly leaned forward, elbows on his knees, listening intently without interruption. Catherine sat beside him, her expression unreadable but her focus entirely fixed on the king. Prince Edward asked careful, procedural questions, trying to understand the mechanics of such a decision within constitutional law. Princess, and, known for her bluntness, is said to have raised the point that the monarchy's continuity depends on avoiding any perception of instability. Then there was the unspoken absence. Harry was not in the room. Whether by choice or circumstance, he had not been invited to this inner circle meeting. That fact alone cast a shadow over the conversation. Those present knew that the exclusion would carry consequences, both personal and public. Without directly naming his younger son, Charles is believed to have made remarks that suggested his focus was on those who could be relied upon to act without distraction from personal agendas or media battles. As the hours passed, the discussion turned from the decision itself to the choreography of how it would be presented to the world. Timing was critical. The fewer people who knew, the less chance of a leak. Every word of the public statement was reviewed and revised, with input from both constitutional experts and communications staff. The final draft was simple and direct, deliberately omitting explanations to project control and decisiveness. The king wanted no ambiguity in the announcement, no sense that he was acting under duress. even if the speed of the decision would invite speculation. By midnight, the tension in the room had shifted from shock to resolve. William's demeanor, according to those who saw him afterward, had hardened. The weight of what lay ahead was settling on him, but so was a sense of inevitability. He did not argue against his father's decision, nor did he indulge in ceremonial platitudes. Instead, he asked about the immediate next steps, security adjustments, constitutional formalities, and the timeline for his first audience with the Prime Minister as king. Catherine's role in those moments was understated but crucial. She listened more than she spoke, intervening only to note the importance of signaling unity in the family's public appearances. Her perspective, one advisor later remarked, seemed to balance the gravity of the decision with the practical needs of presenting it to the nation. By the time the meeting concluded, the participants were sworn to silence until the official announcement. The inner circle dispersed in small groups, some walking together in low conversation, others retreating to private quarters. The king remained behind in the white drawing room for several minutes after the last person left, standing near the fireplace with his hands clasped behind his back, gazing at a portrait of Queen Elizabeth II. For those who caught a final glimpse of him before the doors closed, it was a picture of a man who had made peace with his choice, even if it would shock the world by morning. Outside the palace, the city slept in ignorance of what had just been decided. Streetlights flickered on empty roads, and the Thames moved slowly under the bridges. But inside, the machinery of the monarchy was already shifting. Drafts of press releases were sent to secure printers. Calls to senior government figures were scheduled for dawn. Security teams prepared for immediate changes in protocol once William's new status became public. The palace may have been cloaked in silence, but in reality, it was wide awake, bracing for the moment when this private meeting would become the catalyst for a public transformation. And yet, even as the plan solidified, those who had been in that room could not shake the feeling that history had just turned a corner, not with the slow, deliberate march of tradition, but with a sudden pivot that left no time for second thoughts. The decision had been made, the path ahead was set, and by the next morning, the United Kingdom would awaken to the news that the crown had passed from father to son in the space of a single night. In the hours after the announcement, while the nation grappled with the idea of a new monarch, the unanswered question that began to dominate every conversation was simple yet pressing. Why now? The palace statement had made no mention of health, yet in the vacuum of information, whispers began to gather speed. For many, it was impossible to separate the abruptness of King Charles's decision from the possibility that his health had played a decisive role. Theories spread quickly, fueled by the king's noticeably reduced public schedule in the weeks leading up to the handover and his increasingly private movements within royal residences. Those close to the royal household noted a subtle but undeniable change in Charles's routine over the past 2 months. He had been skipping events that, under normal circumstances, he would have attended without question: state openings, foreign visits, and even certain ceremonial appearances within the UK. While the official explanation was always scheduling adjustments, insiders hinted at a more complicated truth. On several occasions, the king had been seen leaving private medical clinics discreetly, often accompanied by his personal physician and without the usual entourage of aides. While no official diagnosis was shared, the frequency of these visits raised eyebrows among those who had worked for him for years. In the modern monarchy, health matters of a reigning sovereign are a delicate subject. Too much transparency can invite political instability, while too much secrecy can feed damaging speculation. Charles himself had long understood this balance. Yet in recent weeks, his choice to withdraw from high-profile events without offering specific reasons created a sense of unease, even among loyal supporters. The lack of clear communication became fertile ground for journalists and commentators, who began linking his lighter workload to possible underlying health concerns. A small but telling moment occurred just days before the announcement when Charles attended a charity function at Clarence House. Observers noted he appeared slightly gaunter, his movements slower, and his normally brisk handshake a little less firm. Cameras caught him pausing to lean on a chair while speaking with guests, an image that quickly circulated online. Though palace aides dismissed it as fatigue from a busy week, the visual impression lingered in the public consciousness. In an age when every photograph can be analyzed in slow motion and zoomed in 100 times, small gestures take on outsized significance. Medical experts, speaking hypothetically to the media, suggested that if health was a factor, it could range from something manageable but energy draining to something more serious requiring long-term treatment. Without direct confirmation, their theories only added to the swirl of uncertainty. The British press, bound by both tradition and the cautious nature of reporting on royal health, refrained from outright claims but began framing Charles's reduced workload and sudden abdication as part of a broader, personal well-being narrative. Behind palace walls, there was an acknowledgement that the king's well-being had been a concern for some months. While Charles remained mentally sharp and deeply engaged in matters of state, there were private discussions about whether the relentless pace of the role was sustainable for him. The monarchy demands not just ceremonial appearances, but a constant stream of decisions, briefings, and diplomatic engagements. The physical toll is significant, and for a man in his 70s, the accumulation of travel, public speaking, and late-night state paperwork was beginning to show. Those who had seen him in private described moments of visible strain. He had reportedly confided to a trusted aide that the travel schedules, particularly overseas visits, were becoming brutal, and that he sometimes found himself recovering for days afterward. In a family where duty is considered sacred, such admissions are rare, and they underscored the possibility that Charles was more aware than anyone of his limits. For him, the role was not about clinging to the throne for personal pride, but about ensuring the monarchy remained strong and effective. If that meant stepping aside for someone younger and more physically resilient, it might have felt like the responsible choice. Adding to the speculation were the subtle shifts in how the palace managed public images of the king. Official photographs released in the months before the handover were carefully staged, often seated portraits or moments where Charles was engaged in conversation rather than walking or standing for long stretches. Public engagements seemed increasingly clustered in single locations, reducing the need for travel between multiple sites. While such arrangements could be dismissed as efficient planning, seasoned royal watchers recognized them as potential signs of a reduced capacity for prolonged physical activity. International reactions also hinted at health being a factor. Several foreign leaders issued statements not only congratulating William, but also praising Charles for his years of devoted service and wishing him continued health and happiness. The wording struck some as notable, as if the well wishes carried an unspoken understanding of why the transition had happened so suddenly. Still, without an official explanation, the question of health remained suspended in a space between fact and assumption. Some argued that by keeping the matter private, Charles preserved the dignity of his reign and avoided turning the monarchy into a running commentary on his medical records. Others countered that the absence of clarity would only breed distrust, potentially overshadowing William's early days as king. Both perspectives carried weight, and the palace seemed content, at least for now, to let the ambiguity remain. What was undeniable was that Charles's departure from the throne was not born of scandal, political overthrow, or public revolt. If health was indeed at the heart of it, then the story was one of a monarch making a calculated, perhaps even selfless decision, choosing to prioritize the longevity and stability of the crown over personal tenure. And in doing so, he ensured that the next chapter of the monarchy would begin with a king in the prime of his public and physical capacity, ready to shoulder the relentless demands of the role without delay. In the end, whether the true reason was health-related or not, the perception of it would become part of the historical record. Future generations, reading about the rapid transition from Charles to William, would likely see this period as one shaped by both visible and unseen forces. For now, the mystery remained intact, a quiet undercurrent beneath the public pageantry, and one more unanswered question in a day already filled with them. For Prince William, the moment his father's decision became reality was less like the slow turning of a key and more like a sudden door flung wide open. One day, he was the Prince of Wales, steadily fulfilling his role as heir apparent, balancing public duties with his responsibilities as a husband and father. The next, he was the King of the United Kingdom and the Commonwealth, with the full force of history, expectation, and scrutiny pressing down upon him. Even for a man who had spent his life in preparation for this role, The abruptness of the transition created a shockwave that few outside his inner circle could truly understand. The evening before the announcement, William had been with Catherine and their children at Adelaide Cottage in Windsor. It was supposed to be a quiet night, a rare pause in a schedule that rarely allows for them. Reports suggest that it was there, in the privacy of his home, that he received the final call from his father confirming what had been discussed earlier in the day, that the handover would take place immediately. The conversation, according to those familiar with it, was direct and tinged with the gravity of a moment both men knew would change their lives. William did not argue. His father's tone made it clear the decision was final. Instead, he listened, asked measured questions, and assured Charles that he would be ready to do what was needed. After the call ended, William reportedly sat in silence for a long while before speaking. Catherine, who had been nearby, joined him, and the two discussed what the change would mean, not just for the nation, but for their family. They knew that life as they had known it, even under the public gaze, was about to become something far more consuming. Every action, every word, every expression would now be interpreted through the lens of kingship. There would be no easing into it, no extended period of gradual transition. The role was his now, and with it came the immense responsibility of proving himself to a public that both admired and scrutinized him. Those who have worked closely with William over the years describe him as a man who thinks before he acts, who measures his words carefully, and who prefers preparation to improvisation. But in this case, preparation could only go so far. The official statement naming him king was not yet public, yet he already felt the shift. Aides began addressing him differently. Security protocols changed overnight, and state documents were rerouted to his office for review. It was a transformation in title and power that seemed to move faster than even the people enacting it could process. In private, William's emotions were complex. There was pride, of course. Pride in being entrusted with the stewardship of the monarchy and in knowing his father believed in his ability to lead. But there was also a deep, unshakable awareness of the cost. Becoming king meant more than inheriting a title. It meant becoming the embodiment of the nation's stability, the focal point of its traditions, and the figure who must remain unshaken even when the country is divided or uncertain. The personal freedom he had enjoyed, limited though it had always been, was now gone entirely. In those first hours, Catherine's role was not just as a partner, but as a steadying presence. She reminded him of the strength he had shown in the past, the resilience he displayed after the loss of his mother, the composure he maintained during moments of public controversy, the calm he brought to his duties as Prince of Wales. If there was anyone who understood the magnitude of the path ahead, it was Catherine. She knew that his reign would not be measured solely by ceremonies and speeches, but by the quiet, often unseen choices that would shape the monarchy's relevance in the modern age. The morning after his father's announcement, William's first act as king was to meet privately with senior advisors and members of his household. The discussions were pragmatic, focused on the immediate priorities: his first speech to the nation, the scheduling of the coronation, and the diplomatic calls that needed to be made before the news cycle overtook the narrative. Even in these early moments, William showed the leadership style that had long been noted by those close to him, listening first, asking pointed questions, and only then deciding on a course of action. Yet the emotional undercurrent was never far from the surface. When he addressed his staff for the first time as king, he acknowledged the speed of the transition and the challenge it presented. His voice was steady, but those present noticed the faint tightness in his jaw, the kind that comes from holding back the weight of personal feeling. It was not grief, exactly, but a recognition of the enormity of what had just happened. Later that day, William met with Catherine again in a brief private moment before stepping out to face the cameras. She adjusted his tie, rested a hand on his arm, and exchanged a few quiet words with him, words that no microphone caught, but that seemed to settle something in his expression. When he emerged to address the public, the man who had walked out onto the steps of Clarence House was no longer just the son of a king. He was the king. The speech was short, but it carried the tone of someone who understood both the privilege and the burden of his new role. He spoke of continuity, of honoring his father's service, and of dedicating himself to the people of the United Kingdom and the Commonwealth. There were no sweeping promises or political undertones, just a simple, direct acknowledgement of the moment and what it required of him. It was the kind of address that avoided the pitfalls of overstatement, but its restraint was exactly what gave it weight. That evening, when the formalities were over and the cameras gone, William returned to his family. His children, still too young to fully grasp the complexities of what had happened, simply knew that something had changed. There would be new routines, more time in London, and far more attention whenever they appeared in public. William, even in the midst of his own adjustment, took time to reassure them. For all the grandeur of the monarchy, he understood that his first responsibility was still to his family, and that in the months ahead, protecting that foundation would be as important as any state duty. The emotional reality of that day, and the days that followed, was not one of celebration, but of resolve. William had stepped into a role that would define the rest of his life. The swiftness of the change had left little room for reflection, but as the first week of his reign began, he carried himself with the same quiet determination that had earned him public respect for years. He knew the eyes of the world were upon him, measuring his every move. And while the man beneath the crown might still be adjusting to the title, the king understood that his reign had already begun, and there was no turning back. When the news of King Charles's sudden abdication and William's ascension reached Prince Harry, it did not come in the form of a formal palace call. Instead, according to sources close to the Sussex Circle, he learned of it almost simultaneously with the rest of the world, through a flurry of notifications on his phone and a panic call from a friend who had just seen the breaking news banner flash across a major network. For Harry, the moment was like a punch to the chest, not because he was surprised by the idea of William one day becoming king, but because of the speed, secrecy, and exclusion that had marked the decision. This was, after all, the kind of history-defining moment where family bonds, however strained, would once have guaranteed a private call, a word of warning, some acknowledgement of his place in the line of succession. Instead, there was nothing. In Montecito, the atmosphere inside Harry and Meghan's home shifted rapidly from a quiet mourning to a storm of emotion. Meghan, ever attuned to how events would be perceived publicly, reportedly reacted with a sharp mix of disbelief and suspicion. Her first question, according to someone familiar with the exchange, was whether the palace had deliberately left them in the dark. Harry didn't have to answer. The very absence of any prior contact was answer enough. For a man who had once been at the center of the royal machine, the reality of being cut out of the most significant decision in decades was as much an emotional wound as it was a political signal. Harry's initial reaction was not explosive in the outward sense. There were no immediate statements, no live interviews. Instead, he went quiet, retreating into himself as he scrolled through the coverage. Images of William standing with Catherine on the steps of Clarence House filled the screen, every headline speaking in decisive terms. King William IV, the dawn of a new era, the passing of the crown. There was no mention of Harry except in speculative pieces about what the change meant for his already strained relationship with the family. To him, it was as though he had been written out of the narrative entirely, relegated to a footnote in a story that had once been his birthright to witness. Behind closed doors, however, his anger began to surface. In a series of private calls to friends and allies, Harry expressed disbelief at the palace's handling of the matter. He was particularly incensed that, if reports were accurate, William had been informed the night before, while he, Charles's other son, had not even received a courtesy message. To Harry, the exclusion was not just a matter of protocol. It was a deliberate statement about his place in the family, one that underscored the depth of the divide. Meghan's response was sharper, less restrained. She reportedly urged Harry to consider issuing a statement immediately, both to assert their position and to preempt any negative framing in the press. But Harry hesitated. He knew that any public comment made too soon, especially in anger, would be read as bitterness or opportunism. The British tabloids would seize on it as proof that he could not let go of past grievances. So, instead of speaking to the press, he confided to a few trusted figures in the veteran community, people he knew would keep his words off the record. To them, he admitted feeling blindsided and humiliated, as though he had been treated not as a son, but as an outsider with no stake in the institution. The news cycle, however, was relentless. Within hours, commentators were debating Harry's likely feelings. with some suggesting that the move to bypass him entirely was a way to avoid any chance of him complicating the transition. Royal watchers speculated that Charles, aware of the strained relationship between his sons, had deliberately kept the circle small to prevent leaks. This theory, whether true or not, only fueled Harry's sense of alienation. The idea that his own father might have distrusted him enough to exclude him from such a pivotal moment cut deeply. Friends say that one of the hardest moments for Harry came later that evening when he watched William's first public address as king. The speech, dignified and composed, included warm words about Charles's service and a call for unity across the nation. But there was no direct acknowledgement of Harry, no reference to the brother who had once walked beside him through some of the most public and painful moments of their lives. The omission, deliberate or not, was glaring to those who knew the brothers' history. For Harry, it was another reminder that the gulf between them was no longer just personal, it was now institutional. In the days that followed, the Sussexes remained publicly silent, but behind the scenes, the fallout was intense. Meghan, aware of how quickly the press would turn to their absence from the coronation plans, began strategizing how to control their narrative. Harry, meanwhile, weighed whether to request a private audience with his father, not to challenge the decision, but to demand an explanation for the manner in which it was handled. Those close to him say he was torn between the desire to confront Charles directly and the fear that such a conversation would only widen the rift. The situation was complicated by the fact that Harry had, for some time, been trying to maintain a careful balance in his public remarks about his family. His memoir and interviews had laid bare his grievances, but in recent months, he had tried to step back from overt criticism. This development, however, threatened to undo that restraint. For the first time in years, he found himself struggling to decide whether silence would protect him or erase him entirely from the story of the monarchy's future. In the end, the explosive nature of Harry's reaction was less about shouting or public outbursts and more about the private reckoning it forced upon him. It was the quiet fury of a man who felt shut out of a chapter that, for better or worse, he believed he should have been part of. It was the realization that the distance between him and the crown was now measured not just in miles or in titles, but in trust, and that trust, once broken, is far harder to restore than any ceremonial role. By the time the first week of William's reign came to a close, Harry's absence from the palace narrative had become one of its own subplots. Whether by design or by circumstance, the message was clear: the monarchy was moving forward without him. And for Harry, that was perhaps the most explosive truth of all, not the fact that William was king, but that the crown had turned the page without so much as a glance in his direction. In the hours after King Charles's abdication became public and William was declared the new monarch, Meghan Markle's name began appearing in the coverage almost as quickly as Harry's. For some, her presence in the story was inevitable. For others, it was a deliberate choice by commentators to frame the succession through the lens of the family's most public rupture. Whatever the reason, the Meghan factor quickly became a talking point, not because she was directly involved in the decision, but because her influence on Harry and her complicated relationship with the institution hovered over the entire moment like a shadow. Meghan was in California when the news broke, preparing for what was meant to be a routine day filled with meetings for her own projects. The alert came through her phone in the middle of a conversation with an associate, and those present say her reaction was immediate and intense. She scrolled rapidly through the headlines, eyes narrowing as she took in the images of William and Catherine, the formal statement from the palace, and the complete absence of any mention of herself or Harry. If she had expected to be sidelined from the ceremonial spotlight, the speed and finality of the narrative still seemed to catch her off guard. What frustrated Meghan most in those first moments, according to friends, was not the fact that William was now king, that had always been a certainty in the long arc of the monarchy, but the way the announcement reinforced the palace's ability to control the storyline without giving the Sussexes any agency. She understood better than most how perception becomes reality in the royal sphere, and she could see that the optics of the day had been carefully constructed to present a united, modern, and unblemished front. That front did not include her, and it certainly did not include Harry. Almost immediately, Meghan began fielding messages from contacts in the media. Some were fishing for comment, others offering to give her side of the story a platform. She declined every request, at least for the moment. She knew that any reaction, even a seemingly harmless one, would be poured over for tone and subtext. Public silence, she reasoned, would at least deny the palace the satisfaction of painting her as reactive. But behind that controlled exterior, she was strategizing. Those close to her describe how she began making notes, questions she suspected reporters would eventually ask, points she would want to raise if she chose to speak, reminders to herself about the key moments from the past that could be woven into her narrative if the time came. The Meghan factor was not just about her personal feelings. It was also about the broader impact her history with the royal family would have on how people interpreted the succession. In the days following the announcement, several commentators openly speculated that the decision to exclude Harry from the inner circle was as much about limiting Meghan's influence as it was about streamlining the transition. The argument was that any advance warning to Harry could have led, intentionally or not, to leaks or speculation in the press, something the palace was desperate to avoid in what it wanted to present as a smooth and dignified handover. For Meghan, this line of speculation was infuriating. She saw it as a continuation of the narrative she had battled since stepping back from royal duties, that she was an outsider whose presence destabilized the institution. In her view, she had been clear from the beginning that her departure from the UK was about personal well-being and the freedom to live without constant intrusion, not about undermining the monarchy. Yet here she was, once again positioned as a disruptive force, even when she had played no direct role in the events at hand. Privately, she vented her frustration to Harry, pointing out that the palace's silence on their exclusion left the media free to fill in the blanks with whatever theories suited them. She also noted the irony that while she was being portrayed as irrelevant to the future of the monarchy, her name was still being used to sell headlines about its most important transition in decades. Harry listened, agreeing with much of what she said, but urging patience. He knew the situation was delicate, and any misstep could make them appear petty in the face of a national event that was already being celebrated as a new chapter. Still, Meghan understood the media well enough to know that the narrative window was short. If she remained entirely silent for too long, the story would solidify without her input, locking her into whatever role others decided for her. The question was not whether to speak, but how and when. Should she wait for an inevitable interview request from a high-profile outlet, allowing her to frame her thoughts in a controlled environment? Or should she use her own platform to release a carefully crafted statement, bypassing the traditional media altogether? These were the kinds of calculations she had been making since the day she and Harry stepped away from their royal roles. In the meantime, the commentary about her influence continued to ripple through public discourse. Supporters of the Sussexes pointed out that Meghan's absence from palace life had not stopped the monarchy from facing its own internal challenges. Critics countered that her absence was precisely why the transition had gone so smoothly. Social media became a microcosm of this divide, with hashtags alternately praising her independence and blaming her for widening the family rift. Even without making a public appearance, Meghan remained part of the visual conversation. Photographs of her from unrelated events were used in news segments about the succession, often juxtaposed with images of William and Catherine to highlight the contrast between the royal couple's new era and the Sussexes' life abroad. It was a subtle but effective way of reinforcing the idea that two very different visions of royal life now existed, and that Meghan, whether she liked it or not, was the most visible symbol of the one left behind. In the quiet moments at home, Meghan reflected on how far she and Harry had come from the days when they were central figures in the royal narrative. She could see clearly that William's reign would not include them in any significant way, and that the palace would make every effort to ensure their distance was both physical and symbolic. For Meghan, the challenge ahead would be to maintain her own narrative on her own terms, ensuring that her story was not written entirely by others. The Meghan factor, then, was not about her direct role in the abdication or the crowning of William. It was about the ways in which her past, her public image, and her ongoing influence over Harry shaped how the world interpreted the monarchy's most significant change in decades. Whether she chose to speak out or remain silent, her presence in the story was unavoidable, a reminder that even in a new era for the crown, The shadows of old conflicts still lingered, shaping the light that now fell on the throne. The morning of the public crowning ceremony began long before the sun touched the spires of Westminster Abbey. London was awake in the darkness, its streets echoing with the rumble of security convoys, the rhythmic steps of guards on patrol, and the low hum of generators powering the media hubs that had sprung up overnight. Every major broadcaster had carved out a space along the procession route, their cameras trained on the spot where history would unfold. The air was damp with the lingering chill of dawn, and the scent of fresh rain clung to the cobblestones, making the gold trim on the ceremonial carriages glisten under the first sweep of light. For the British public, the ceremony was more than a formality. It was the physical manifestation of the moment they had been processing since the shock announcement. People had traveled from across the country, many arriving in the capital the night before, wrapped in blankets and Union Jack flags as they camped along the barricades. Some held handmade signs welcoming King William. Others carried framed photographs of past monarchs, as if bridging the centuries with a personal gesture. There was excitement, but also a thread of curiosity. This was not the coronation anyone had expected to see so soon, and the abruptness of it gave the day an undercurrent of intensity. Inside the abbey, the preparations were as meticulous as they were steeped in tradition. The nave was lined with arrangements of white roses and lilies, chosen to reflect both the solemnity and the promise of renewal. The choir rehearsed softly, their voices weaving through the ancient stone arches, the sound bouncing back like whispers from the past. Every seat had been assigned with precision, the guest list a balance of heads of state, royal family members, military leaders, religious figures, and carefully selected members of the public who represented the breadth of the nation. The atmosphere was a blend of sacred ritual and quiet anticipation, each person acutely aware of the historical weight of the moment. The first glimpse of William as king that day came when the royal carriage emerged from Buckingham Palace, drawn by a team of gleaming Windsor greys. He wore the ceremonial robe over a perfectly tailored dark uniform, the deep red and gold catching the morning light. His face was composed, but his eyes carried the kind of focus that comes from understanding the gravity of every step he was taking. Beside him, Catherine exuded calm grace, her gown simple but elegant, her crown a symbol of her new role as queen consort. Together, they projected unity, a deliberate choice to present themselves not just as sovereign and consort, but as a team stepping into a shared destiny. Along the route, the crowd erupted in waves of applause and cheers, mixed with moments of near silence as the carriage passed. Children waved small flags from their parents' shoulders, elderly veterans saluted as the royal couple went by, and tourists scrambled to capture the perfect photograph. The sound of the procession, the steady clop of hooves, the roll of the carriage wheels, the distant toll of abbey bells, blended into a rhythm that seemed almost ceremonial in itself. When the carriage arrived at Westminster Abbey, the doors were thrown open, revealing the grandeur within. William and Catherine stepped onto the carpeted walkway, greeted by the Archbishop of Canterbury. The cameras zoomed in on William's handshake, the brief exchange of words between him and the Archbishop, and the subtle nods of acknowledgement from senior clergy. The moment William crossed the threshold, the choir's voices rose in unison, filling the space with music that seemed to vibrate in the chest of every person present. The ceremony unfolded with a precision born of centuries of practice. William knelt before the altar, repeating the oaths that bound him not only to govern, but to serve. His voice was steady, the cadence deliberate, as if each word was being placed into history with care. The regalia, the orb, the scepter, the ring, were presented one by one, each accompanied by ancient phrases and blessings. When the Archbishop placed St. Edward's crown upon William's head, the abbey seemed to hold its breath for a heartbeat before the organ thundered to life, and the congregation rose to its feet. Outside, cannon fire echoed across the city, a rolling boom that marked the official beginning of his reign. Catherine's moment followed. Her own crowning met with warm applause and a sense of continuity that bridged the ceremony's solemnity with the public's affection. As queen consort, she would not hold sovereign power, but her role was unmistakably central to the image and stability of the monarchy going forward. Her demeanor, poised, respectful, and quietly confident, reinforced the sense that this was not just William's reign, but a partnership that would define the new royal era. Beyond the ritual, the ceremony was filled with deliberate choices that spoke to William's vision for his reign. Representatives from across the Commonwealth were given prominent roles in the proceedings, their cultural dress and contributions woven into the fabric of the event. Leaders from diverse faith communities stood alongside Anglican clergy, symbolizing a broader, more inclusive approach to national unity. Even the music blended traditional hymns with newly commissioned pieces, underscoring the theme of honoring the past while embracing the present. As the formalities drew to a close, William addressed the assembled guests and the nation watching from their homes. His speech was brief but personal, reflecting gratitude to his father for his service, recognition of the challenges facing the country, and a commitment to lead with integrity and empathy. He spoke of unity, of the responsibility that comes with the crown, and of his determination to ensure the monarchy remained relevant in a rapidly changing world. The words were not grandiose, but they were authentic, and they resonated with many who had wondered how he would set himself apart as king. When the royal couple emerged from the abbey, the sunlight broke through the clouds as if on cue, bathing the scene in a warm glow. The cheers of the crowd were deafening now, amplified by the knowledge that they had just witnessed something that would be recorded in history books, replayed in documentaries, and remembered for generations. The carriage ride back to Buckingham Palace was slower, more deliberate, allowing the people to take in the sight of their new king and queen in the first moments of their public reign. By the time they stepped onto the balcony, flanked by members of the royal family who had been part of the day's events, the transition felt complete. The crowd below stretched as far as the eye could see, a sea of faces turned upward, some beaming, others simply taking it all in. William raised his hand in a modest wave. Catherine mirrored the gesture, and for a few minutes, the divisions and debates that often swirl around the monarchy seemed to quiet. In that shared moment between sovereign and people, the crowning was not just a ceremonial act. It was the visible sealing of a new chapter in the nation's story. The impact of King William's ascension was felt far beyond the streets of London or the walls of Westminster Abbey. Within hours of the coronation ceremony, the political ripples began to spread across the Commonwealth, touching capitals thousands of miles away. The transition had been sudden, and while the United Kingdom had been caught off guard, so too had many of the 14 other realms where the British monarch remains head of state. In some, the news was met with measured congratulations and reassurances of continuity. In others, it triggered renewed debates about whether the time had come to cut constitutional ties altogether. In Australia, the change at the top reignited a discussion that had simmered quietly for years. The Prime Minister, speaking in a televised address, offered formal congratulations to King William and emphasized the enduring friendship between the two nations. Yet within hours, opposition leaders and prominent Republicans were on air suggesting that this moment of generational change presented an opportunity for Australians to consider a head of state of their own. Newspapers in Sydney and Melbourne ran side-by-side coverage. On one page, images of William and Catherine's crowning. On the next, op-eds asking whether the monarchy still reflected Australia's identity in the 21st century. In Canada, the reaction was more subdued but no less complex. The Governor-General issued a statement of loyalty to the new king, while the Prime Minister called William a steadfast friend of Canada and spoke warmly of his commitment to the Commonwealth. Yet among political analysts, there was quiet acknowledgement that Canada's constitutional monarchy had been maintained as much by inertia as by deep affection. William's reign, they said, could be an opportunity either to reinvigorate that bond or to allow it to fade naturally. Indigenous leaders, too, used the moment to call for renewed dialogue on reconciliation, noting that the monarchy's role in Canada's colonial past could not be ignored in discussions about its future. In New Zealand, the handover carried a different kind of weight. The country's Prime Minister, in her statement, praised William's environmental advocacy and his personal visits to the nation following natural disasters. But the political landscape there had shifted in recent years, and the conversation about becoming a republic was no longer confined to the fringes. Local commentators pointed out that William's popularity could slow that movement temporarily, but it was unlikely to halt it altogether. The question was not if, but when, New Zealanders would decide to chart their own constitutional course. In the Caribbean, the response was perhaps the most telling of the monarchy's changing fortunes. Several nations, Barbados most recently, had already transitioned to republics, and others had signaled their intent to follow. In Jamaica, the Prime Minister extended formal congratulations but reaffirmed the government's commitment to holding a referendum on becoming a republic within the next few years. In Antigua and Barbuda, the leadership was more direct, stating that while they wished King William well, the country's path toward constitutional independence would proceed as planned. For many in the region, the shift from Charles to William was less about personalities and more about the long-term process of redefining their own governance. Across Africa, where the Commonwealth's legacy is layered with both cooperation and colonial history, reactions varied. In Kenya, the president welcomed William's ascension and extended an invitation for a state visit, highlighting shared initiatives in conservation and education. In South Africa, political leaders were split, some viewing the monarchy as a partner in trade and cultural exchange, others questioning its relevance in the post-apartheid era. Nigeria's officials expressed diplomatic goodwill, but civil society groups used the moment to revisit discussions about the country's colonial past and the symbolic meaning of maintaining ties to the British Crown. The political ripples were not confined to individual nations. They also reached into the Commonwealth itself as an institution. The Secretary-General issued a statement underscoring the unity of the member states and the symbolic role of the monarch as head of the Commonwealth. Yet behind the scenes, diplomats acknowledged that the cohesion of the organization was being tested. For some members, the connection to the British monarch remained a source of cultural and historical continuity. For others, it was a reminder of a relationship they no longer wished to formalize. In London, the Foreign and Commonwealth Office began coordinating outreach to ensure that William's reign started on stable ground abroad. Plans for a series of overseas visits were quickly sketched, with the aim of reinforcing ties before debates in certain countries could gain too much momentum. Advisors stressed that William's personal popularity, bolstered by his years of diplomatic work and his approachable public image, was one of the monarchy's strongest assets in maintaining its role within the Commonwealth. The challenge would be translating that goodwill into tangible commitments from governments whose political priorities were shifting. Media coverage in different countries painted a vivid picture of how William's ascension was being perceived globally. In some capitals, his crowning was seen as a chance for renewal, a younger monarch who could relate to contemporary concerns such as climate change, technology, and youth engagement. In others, it was framed as the last chapter before a long-anticipated constitutional shift. The tone was not hostile so much as pragmatic, the recognition that the monarchy's symbolic role could be respected without being retained indefinitely. One of the most significant political implications of the transition was the potential for William to redefine the relationship between the Crown and the Commonwealth. Unlike his father, whose reign was marked by efforts to preserve long-standing traditions, William had an opportunity to recast the monarchy's role as a facilitator of shared goals rather than a relic of past power structures. Diplomats close to him suggested that he was already considering ways to modernize ceremonial protocols, streamline state visits, and focus on collaborative projects that aligned with the priorities of individual member states. Still, the challenges ahead were clear. A coronation, no matter how grand, could not erase the historical realities that shaped the Commonwealth's present, nor could it guarantee loyalty in an era when national identities were being redefined and younger generations were less tied to symbols of the past. For William, the ripples of his ascension were not just about managing diplomatic relationships. They were about navigating a political landscape in which the monarchy's relevance would have to be proven, not assumed. By the end of the first week of his reign, the early signs were mixed. In some nations, the excitement of a new monarch had sparked renewed engagement with the Commonwealth. In others, it had merely accelerated conversations about independence. The political ripples were moving outward still, touching places far from London, but connected by centuries of history. Whether those ripples would draw the Commonwealth closer together or signal the beginning of a slow drift apart was a question only time, and the actions of the new king, could answer.